And now we are going to look at the Spanish as well as the Columbian Exchange. This is also a continuation of Chapter 1. So, Spain, Spanish. Keep in mind, just setting the stage, they've just finished the whole Reconquista again. Remember, reconquering the Iberian Peninsula and everything like that. The Reconquista, this actually really gives the Spanish an edge when it comes to dominating the New World or the Americas. First of all, it has that religious rationale behind conquest. Secondly, they have an established military with, like seasoned veterans of war. And these seasoned veterans of war, on top of that, have techniques for, controlling newly conquered lands. And now they can apply this directly to the New World or the Americas. Now I'm going to go into 3 different instances here. Really think about themes that repeat more so than like specifics on each of these. So for instance, when we have the Spanish versus the Aztecs, this is in 1519 when Hernan Cortez lands with about 600 soldiers off the coast of Mexico. When he lands, he is said to have quoted, "I have a disease that can only be cured by gold." So not exactly subtle there what they're going for. They landed in 1519. They have victory over the Aztecs by 1521. So it's fairly quickly, done very quickly, partly because of like technological advances like guns, horses, and then a big one is that they just exploited divisions within the Aztec Empire itself. Like I said before, the Aztecs dominated other native peoples and made them subservient to them. And so basically the Spanish came in and got allies amongst these Indians who resented Aztec domination. And then, of course, the biggest thing that helped them out was disease. In fact, nearly 40% of the inhabitants of central Mexico are going to die of smallpox within a year. 40% of the population within a year of one disease, smallpox, and keep in mind there's other diseases on top of that like typhus, measles, influenza. In fact, looking at the numbers, by 1600, so keep in mind Columbus lands in 1492, 1600, so just over 100 years later, the population of Mexico has gone from about 15 million to less than 1 million, and that's with Europeans coming over. Then we have the Spanish versus the Incas. The Incas, when the Spanish arrived, they've just recently had a civil war following their ruler's death. So we got that instability going on. Francisco Pizarro arrives in 1532. It's pretty quick, and afterwards the inhabitants are going to have to pay compulsory tribute payments and do forced labor for the Spanish. They would especially be forced to work in like the silver mines in Peru and Bolivia, as well as on like sugar plantations in the Caribbean. And then the Spanish, we're going to see with like the Incas as well as Aztecs and everything, they're going to start importing African slaves when they need them to supplement the workers that are dying of, disease and other factors. But then if you go north, things are not quite the same. So for instance, in 1539, Hernan de Soto is going to land in Florida, and then him and his men are basically going to go on a rampage all the way over to the Mississippi River. They would harass Native Americans, they'd demand provisions, they burn villages, they'd capture women as servants and force them to be concubines as well. We're going to see a little bit of a Spanish presence there, but not as much as, further south. We're also going to see further north in like North America, we get Francisco Vasquez de Coronado lands in 1540. Him and about 300 troops go on this destructive expedition in what is like present day Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona. What are they looking for? I bet you could guess. Gold as well as stones. The thing is, the Spanish, when they landed in these areas, basically they don't find gold, and when they don't find gold, they stop going further north. That being said, they do keep Florida as well as the Atlantic coast to a certain extent, mostly because it means that this is a place that they can defend their Spanish treasure fleets from raids by like the English and French privateers. They also stay in New Mexico for a time looking for silver mines, though actually by like 1598, they've antagonized the local inhabitants so much so they can barely keep a foothold in that economy. So I want you to now go to your journal, and you can pause this or you can go to it at the end of this, and I want you to characterize the Spanish in America, or in the Americas really, in one sentence or left. What kind of themes do you really see here? Now there is an exception to some of these themes. I'll let you pause actually if you want to. Now there is an exception to some of these themes. One of these, the exception, big one, is Bartolomé de la Casa. He was a Dominican priest. He was ashamed by the role that he had played in the conquest of Hispaniola, and so he had then gone on to write about the native local inhabitants there and how the Spanish, as well as others, you know, needed to respect them and help them and everything like that. Unfortunately, when his works are published back in Europe, it doesn't convince people necessarily to help the natives. Really what it does is it convinces Protestants back in Europe that clearly we have a fanatical Catholic Spain that will seek out to spread its religion at any cost to the population, no matter what. And so it's not about, it ends up not causing any reforms, and really it more just inspires Protestant Europeans against Catholic Spain at this time. That being said, conquering the Americas did cause a lot of problems for the Spanish. For instance, the riches are going to gut Spain's treasury, and in fact, merchants have so much gold, they don't necessarily look to invest their gold. And if you're not putting money back into the economy, what happens is the economy stagnates, and that's exactly what happens here. On top of that, Spain did some things like they kicked out all of the Jewish people from the entire country of Spain in 1492. So right after that whole Reconquista Catholic, you can see how that whole religion ties into that as well. But the thing is, when they kick out that entire Jewish population, that population might have had gold that they might have been willing to, you know, invest in the economy and everything, but obviously they can't if they're not in Spain. Which actually brings us to the next slide. So the thing is, when we're looking at all that gold coming back from the Americas to Spain, we're really looking at the Columbian Exchange. And this slide, as well as the next slide, are going to talk about this. The Columbian Exchange, though, is not just items being transferred from the Americas to the Old World, but it was a two-way street. That items were coming from the Old World to the New, and from the New World to the Old. When you're looking at this slide, please don't like write down all of these or anything like that. Like for instance, looking at disease, the top line, smallpox, measles, typhus, influenza, those are things coming from the Old World, which would be like Europe and Africa, that came to the Americas or the New World. And then the second line, syphilis, hey, there's one disease that came from the Americas and was transferred over to Europe and Africa or the Old World. We see also this with other items such as animals and plants. You can see the list here. The problem with some of these animals coming over from the Old World to the New World is problematic in that some of them didn't have like a natural predator in the Americas, and so they flourish and they actually become too dominant. They become invasive species, and we've been looking at invasive species probably in the news. You've probably seen things about like killer wasps and everything. Anyway, this is also why, like today, if you ever travel abroad, a lot of times they have you sign something that says, I did not bring any kind of, you know, seeds or certain kinds of meats and things like that from this country to home, and yada, yada, yada. We're also going to see other animals like honeybees, black rats, and even like certain plants, like when you're looking at weeds, thistles, and dandelions, you're like, why would anyone bring those over? Those weren't necessarily brought over on purpose. It was more like those would be in the wheat or the hay that they would bring over to feed their horses on the ship and things like that. You can also see that there's a lot of items that came from the New World and went to the Old World, such as corn, tomatoes, squash, beans, all these, as well as turkeys. And the reason I point this out, fun fact, if you ever go to like a medieval or Renaissance fair kind of thing, a lot of times one of the big food items is a turkey leg. Turkeys were not indigenous to Europe. They would not have existed in Europe during the Middle Ages. So fun fact there. So you can see here a list of some of the other items that were coming in. This gives you that map to be looking at that entire Columbian Exchange. So I want you to take a second. This is actually the second part of your participation today, is compare this to today. Looking at the Columbian Exchange, how is it similar? How is it different? I'm going to pause so you can pause if you need to. Okay, I'm going to move on. The thing is, when we're looking at the Columbian Exchange, though, it's not just an exchange of items, it's also an exchange of ideas. And there's going to be a lot of conflict because of these ideas. Because, as you probably know or already have seen with some of our primary sources, the ideas and culture of the Europeans was not that of the Native Americans. The thing is, Europe was very hierarchical in everything. It was very structured. You can see this in their religion, like the Catholic Church. You know, they have their Pope, their archbishops, their archdeacons, their deacons, and so on and so forth. Even in the Protestant Church, to an extent, like the Anglican Church, which was the English Protestant Church, they tended to have these kinds of structures. You see it even in just like families in Europe, that it was very much that the man was over the women and children of the house. And women literally went from being owned basically by their father to being owned by their husband. There's not a whole lot of freedom. This isn't going to necessarily be the case for Native Americans. And in fact, you can look at this and see it in the gender roles as well. For instance, in Europe, men's work was to farm while women did the work at home and like raised the children. Hunting is this other recreational activity. It was really something more for the rich. That wasn't a part of European society in the same way it was for Native Americans. And so the thing is, it's going to be problematic when, for natives, they look at women's dominant role was farming while men hunted for subsistence. And so Native Americans, oftentimes, like when we look at these two groups coming together, Europeans would view Indian women as like having a slavish lifestyle, whereas Native Americans are going, Europe, you're not making good use of your women. We also can see religion is very prominent in European society. It's intertwined in everything. A lot of times the first universities were really funded through religion. A lot of times it was learning how to write so they could make Bibles and everything back in the Middle Ages. And so obviously they're going to have a different religion than the Native Americans, and that's going to cause conflict. We also see the Europeans wanted to dominate the lands they discovered. And of course, Native Americans aren't necessarily going to be okay with just being dominated. They wanted to maintain their own autonomy. That being said, as much as a lot of these ideas could cause huge conflicts, these conflicts don't actually always have to be large. They could be very small. Things like, for the first time, an Indian meeting a European takes a sword by its edge, not knowing. And then vice versa, things like you have the Iroquois Native Americans that would be up in like modern day Canada and northern United States and everything. When they met the French, they were very big into smoking, and the French had never smoked before. And so when they smoked, they would choke on these pipes and everything. So it could be small conflicts. On top of that, the conflicts don't always have to be between the Native Americans and Europeans. There's also going to be conflict between Europeans themselves. And this is actually what's going to lead to the Treaty of Tortoise I, which is our last slide on this section, in 1494. The thing is, this treaty was made between the Spanish and the Portuguese, and it was basically designed to keep other European countries out of the Americas. it wanted to keep other European countries from colonizing the Americas. You can see they basically drew a line here. Everything to the west of this line would be in the Spanish possession. Everything east would be the Portuguese. So this means Portugal has like Africa, Asia, Brazil, whereas Spain has the rest of the Americas, except for that part that is Brazil. And you can actually see that too today, because if you go to like South America, most of the countries there speak Spanish to today, except for the Portuguese, which, except for Brazil, which speaks Portuguese. The thing is, when they made this agreement, they didn't have like maps of the Americas yet, and so you might be going, well, wait a second, why did Portugal get so much less than Spain did? Well, a lot of it is this actually gave Portugal a lot because it had a lot of different colonies, remember, along the coast of Africa and islands there, and these sugar plantations that made a lot of money, and so this was basically a guarantee that Spain wasn't going to try to take those away from them. So that was really important. Now, what about other countries, though? Countries like France and England. The thing is, France and England are going to reject this papal grant. But they have a lot of problems at home. And remember, you need that stability at home before you can really colonize the Americas. And so they really couldn't pursue these colonies and fight it until much later.